The desert teaches you to read silence before it reads you. That is the first thing they tell you at the schoolhouse, and the last thing you remember when the silence stops being empty and starts being something else, something that breathes, that waits, that has weight. I didn't understand that when I arrived at Cop Harlow. I was 23 years old, a freshly pinned second lieutenant with a crease in my uniform and a head full of doctrine, and I thought I understood silence because I'd grown up in Kansas wheat country where the wind dies in August and the whole world holds its breath. I didn't understand anything. Harlow sat at the upper lip of the Marin Reach, that long dry corridor of broken shale and bleached river stone that runs northeast toward the Collie's Wash, a place the maps labeled a seasonal waterway and the men labeled a killing ground. The outpost itself was a converted border customs station, 3 prefab HESCO walls on the north and east, an older stone wall on the south that had been there since before anyone's grandfather was born, and a fourth side that faced the high desert scrub and the distant smudge of the village of Sabot, 2 clicks down the grade. 11 buildings in Sabot, a school that doubled as an aid station, a well, a mosque with 1 minaret, its whitewash gone gray with alkali dust, and somewhere inside it, 3 aid workers from a German NGO and a schoolteacher who'd been running literacy classes for the village children, held for 14 days by the time I signed the property book and took command of the post. 31 soldiers, 2 gun trucks, 1 mortar pit with a cracked base plate that Sergeant Doyle had flagged twice in his maintenance reports and been told twice that the replacement was on the next resupply. A comm suite that worked when the heat didn't warp the satellite dish, which in August on the Marin Reach meant it worked at night sometimes, if you didn't ask it to do too much. And 1 new supply NCO, Staff Sergeant Renata Voss, who arrived on the flatbed the same morning I did, sitting on a pallet of MREs with her elbows on her knees and her eyes moving across the post's perimeter in a slow, even circuit that I didn't know how to read yet. I was a second lieutenant on his first command. I read everything as either threat or non-threat. Staff Sergeant Voss read as non-threat. Small woman, mid-30s at a guess, with a plain face and dark hair pulled tight under her patrol cap. No unit patch I recognized on her left shoulder. She'd sewn it over with a subdued quartermaster flash, the kind so low visibility it read as blank at 10 feet. Her rank was on her chest, not her collar, which was standard, but her collar had a faint ghost of where something had been removed, a shadow in the fabric where rank may once have sat at a different level. I didn't notice that at the time. What I noticed was that Sergeant First Class Doyle, who had been running this post through 2 rotations, and who wore the particular kind of quiet that comes from having seen things go badly wrong more than once, brought her a cup of coffee before he brought me mine. And that when she took it, she looked at him the way you look at a person you are measuring, not for threat, but for what they know that you don't know yet. Doyle set her in with the supply section, the Connex containers stacked on the east side of the compound, 3 of them, loaded with ammunition and water and fuel and parts, and the accumulated detritus of a post that had been resupplied sporadically and inventoried never. The property book was, in Doyle's words, a crime against accounting. Boxes signed for that weren't there. Items present that hadn't been signed for in 3 years. A weapons sub-hand receipt that listed 1 Mk-19 grenade launcher that had departed for another fob 14 months ago and had never been removed from the books. I asked Doyle what he wanted to do with her. He looked at me, a long, flat look, the kind that a man gives a new lieutenant when the new lieutenant has just said something that reveals exactly how new he is. "She's going to fix the property book, sir," he said. "That's her job." "How long will that take?" She said 9 days. I looked at the Connex containers. 3 of them, floor to ceiling, improperly packed, labels faded, in a heat that was already climbing past 100 at 9 in the morning. 9 days seems optimistic, I said. Doyle didn't answer that. He just finished his coffee. On the first morning, I held a post brief at 0730. All the NCOs and section leaders gathered at the operations center, which was the largest room in the main building, with a sand table in the middle and a whiteboard on the east wall. I laid out the sectors. I assigned the watch rotation. I talked about the hostage situation in Sabbat and the guidance from higher: observe, report, do not escalate. The relief column that was supposed to come through with more resources was 3 to 5 days out, depending on the road from the east. I handed Staff Sergeant Voss the latrine roster. I did it without thinking. She was supply. She was the most junior staff sergeant in the section. The latrine detail was a rotation among the lower enlisted, and someone had to track it, and she was standing at the back of the room, notebook open, looking at the whiteboard, and I handed it to her the way you hand something to whoever is nearest. The room noticed. I didn't notice the room noticing. She took the roster, said nothing, made a note. That was day 1. She had the first container open, before I was done with my morning brief. By the time I walked the perimeter at 1000 hours, she had a folding table set up outside the connex with a clipboard, a printed manifest, and 2 junior soldiers from the supply section sorting equipment into piles on a poncho liner spread across the gravel. She didn't look up when I passed. She was checking serial numbers against a handwritten ledger, reading them aloud in a low voice, and one of the soldiers was checking them against the computer printout. Methodical, that was the word for it. Not fast, not dramatic, just methodical, the way a surgeon cleans an instrument or a watchmaker lays out parts, each piece in its place, nothing overlooked. I didn't pay much attention. I had other things to manage. On the afternoon of the second day, she came to me at the ops center and told me the south observation post was covering the wrong ground. I asked her what she meant. The mouth of the south draw, she said. The post is angled to watch the road, but the dead ground below the road, there's a low water cut that runs from the tree line at the wash to the base of the grade. You can move 40, 50 people through it at night, and the op doesn't see any of them. I looked at the sand table. The op was positioned where the previous officer had positioned it, covering the road approach, which was doctrine. The road's the main avenue of approach, I said. Yes, sir, she said, but the draw's the one nobody's watching. I told her I'd look at it. Doyle found me an hour later. You talked to Voss. She flagged the south op. He looked at the sand table, said nothing for a moment. Then, she flagged the same thing this morning. She came to you first. She came to me, he said, and I told her to take it to you. I looked at the op position again. I walked it in my head. The road was the main approach. The doctrine was clear. And the draw, yes, there was dead ground there, but it was rough going, steep, heavy brush, not a natural choice for a force moving with any kind of speed. We'll keep the op where it is, I said, but I'll add a tripwire flare in the cut. Doyle looked at me the way he'd looked at me that first morning. Then he nodded and walked away. That evening, Voss was still at the connex when the sun went down. She'd set up a work lamp, a single low-wattage unit that threw a cone of amber light across the table, and she was still checking serials, still calling them out, still making marks in the ledger. I stopped and watched her for a moment from the other side of the compound. One of the young privates from her section was dozing against the container wall. She hadn't sent him to bed. On the third morning, she came back to the ops center. She had the ledger with her, and she set it open on the table next to the sand table, and she showed me something. The north gun, she said. The elevation record shows it's been firing at this range. She pointed to a notation for the last 8 months, standard engagement distance. But if something comes over the north berm at close range, inside 200 meters, the gun can't depress far enough. The stop block is in the wrong position. The gun crew knows the gun, I said. They know what they've been shooting at, she said. They haven't had to depress to close range since the previous rotation. The block's been moved and not moved back. She paused. I found it when I was cross-checking the maintenance records against the armorer's log. The discrepancy goes back to March. I looked at her. A supply NCO who had been on the post for 3 days, who spent her time in a Connex container counting boxes, was telling me my North gun had a mechanical defect the gun crew hadn't caught. "How do you know what the stop block position should be?" I asked. She looked at me, level, without anything in her face that was anger or challenge, just a look. "I'll write it up," she said. "You can have Doyle check it." Doyle checked it. The block was in the wrong position. He fixed it in 40 minutes with 2 tools and a socket set, and when he came back inside, he didn't say anything about it for a while. He just wrote it in the maintenance log. That night, around the burn barrel after evening chow, one of the older staff sergeants, a 12-year man named Thibodeau, who ran the weapons section, and who had the humor of a man who has had humor beaten into him by experience, started a story I'd heard pieces of before. The Pilgrim story. I'd heard it referenced in passing since I arrived, not in briefings, but around fires, the way men pass around the things that matter to them when no one official is listening. The name Pilgrim in the way soldiers use a name that has become a word, not a person anymore, a category, a standard, a legend that had been distilled down to its essential shape. The story went like this. 3 years ago, a lone operator walked into a stone building in a contested village and brought 11 people out alive. No backup, no CAS, no armor. The building had been held by 12 armed men. She went in as a reconciliation representative, a Red Crescent functionary carrying nothing visible. She came out with 11. The 12 men inside, 3 of them found by the unit that arrived 40 minutes later. The other 9 were gone, and nobody ever said where. She had no call sign on file. The unit that found the building afterward asked the question up the chain and never got an answer. The legend filled the gap with a name, Pilgrim. Thibodeau told it the way a man tells a story he half believes, because he wants to believe the half he doesn't. Across the compound, the amber light over the Connex table went out. Voss had finished for the night. She finished the property book in 9 days. Not approximately 9 days. Not 8 days with a few loose ends and a promise to reconcile the rest. 9 days, and when she delivered the completed ledger to Doyle on the morning of day 9, it was 94 pages, handwritten and typed, with every serial number accounted for, every discrepancy annotated, every missing item flagged with the documentation trail of where it had gone and what form had authorized the transfer. The Mk-19, the grenade launcher that had been on the books for 14 months after it left, had a complete chain of custody going back to the original turn-in form at the FOB, including the name of the sergeant major who had signed it over and the date, which matched the FOB's own inventory record that had never been reconciled against ours. Doyle read through the first 30 pages. Then he set it down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "She also flagged the dead stock in container 3, he said. "The illumination rounds." I looked up from my own work. "What about them?" "We have 43 rounds of 60mm illumination that weren't on the manifest. They came in on the same pallet as a water resupply 6 months ago and never got entered into the system. Supply section at the FOB didn't catch them. We didn't catch them." He paused. "She found them because she actually counted every pallet. 43 rounds of illumination. On a post that covered a long slope running north-south in the dark, on terrain where the dead ground was already a concern, where the collies washed to the south could move a force at night across ground that the ops didn't fully cover. 43 illumination rounds were not nothing. They were the difference between seeing and not seeing. She'd put them in a separate column in the ledger, a quiet column, no emphasis, no underline, just 60 mm M720 QTY 43 condition serviceable location, Con 3 pallet 7, not previously entered on DA 2062. Recommend immediate entry and integration into fire support plan." I read that line 3 times. She came in while I was reading it. "The fire support plan," I said, not quite a question. "You have illumination you're not using," she said. "The gap in coverage on the south draw, the one I flagged on day 2, you can partially compensate for it with a pre-planned illumination mission. If you set the trigger point here," she stepped to the sand table, put her finger on the draw's mouth, "and string a tripwire to a pop flare at the bend of the cut, you've got enough warning time to drop a lum on the dead zone before a force clears it." I looked at Doyle. He was looking at the sand table with the expression of a man who has just been told something obvious by someone who had no business knowing it was obvious. "That's a fire support solution," I said. "You're a supply NCO." She didn't answer that directly. She just said, "Do you want me to draw up the trigger matrix?" I told her no. I told her I would handle it. I took the ledger to my desk and I sat with it for 2 hours, reading through her annotations, and somewhere around page 60, I stopped trying to figure out how a supply sergeant with a quartermaster flash on her shoulder knew what a triggering matrix for an illumination mission was. That afternoon, I found Doyle at the motor pool. "Voss," I said, "what's her background?" He looked at the truck he was checking, then at me. "She came in on attachment orders from a training detachment in Bragg." "That's not an answer." "No, sir," he said, "it's not. She knows fire support." He made a small sound, not quite a laugh. "She knows a lot of things." "Such as?" "Such as," he said, "the reason the stone wall on the south side doesn't have the same firing line as the rest of the perimeter is that the original customs post was built to cover the pass to the east, not the grade to the south, and if you were going to use it as a fighting position in a linear defense, you'd need to add 2 sandbag bunkers at the southeast corner to compensate for the angle, and the material for that is sitting in container 2 under the water cans." He looked at me. "She told me that yesterday." I said nothing. "She also told me," he said, "that the village of Sabot, the layout, the way the buildings are oriented, the schoolhouse in the center, it's set up like a lock. One entrance from the north, one from the east, buildings arranged so you can control all movement from 2 positions. If somebody who knew what they were doing wanted to hold it, they'd put 2 men at the north corner and 1 on the minaret, and they'd own the whole town with 3 bodies." He paused. "Sir," he said, "I've been here 2 rotations. I've looked at that village every day for 14 months. I never saw it as a lock." I walked back to the ops center. I stood in front of the sand table. I looked at the sand model of Sabot, the 11 buildings, the school, the well, the mosque with its single minaret. 3 bodies, north corner, east corner, the height. She was right, it was a lock. That evening, I almost moved the south op. Almost. The radio woke me at 0240. Not the duty radio, the backup handset I kept on the shelf above my cot, tuned to the op frequency. It squealed once, which was the code for contact, and before I was fully upright Doyle was already in the doorway. "South op," he said, "movement in the draw." I was dressed and at the ops center in 90 seconds. The duty soldier, Private Rays, had the radio live and was writing on the log. The South Op was a 2-man position, specialists Garza and Fitch, and Garza was transmitting in the low, controlled voice of a man who is trying very hard not to breathe too loud. "Estimate 15 to 20 elements moving north through the cut. On foot, no lights. They're past the bend." Past the bend, past where the tripwire flare should have been. I'd placed a flare at the south end of the cut. I hadn't placed one at the bend. I decided the south trigger was sufficient. 15 to 20 elements. The post had 31 soldiers, 2 of them on the south op and 4 on the north gate, and another 2 on the east wall. The effective response force I could put on the line in 6 minutes was roughly 22 personnel, and if 15 to 20 hostiles cleared the draw and made the base of the grade, they'd be inside the wire in another 4 minutes. I gave the alert order. Doyle executed it. What happened in the next 11 minutes I have described in after-action reports, in testimony. and in the statement I gave to the investigation. I will tell it here in the order that I remember it, which is not always the same order as the timeline, because in that kind of dark and that kind of speed, the mind does not file things neatly. I remember the north gun. I remember that Doyle had the crew running before I reached the ops center, and that the adjustment Voss had flagged, the stop block, corrected on day 3, meant the gun could now depress to close range if the threat came over the north berm rather than down the road. I remember thinking about that in the same split second I was thinking about the south draw, which was a luxury of terror, noticing the things that had been fixed. I remember the illumination rounds. Doyle had them on the mortar already. 43 rounds, integrated into the plan I'd written from Voss's trigger matrix and hadn't given her credit for, not even in my own head. And now those 43 rounds were the difference between a black draw and a lit one. The first round popped at 500 feet above the cut. What it showed us, 12 men, not 15 to 20, spread across a front of about 80 meters, moving fast, already at the base of the grade. And behind them at the draw's mouth, another 6 or 8, hanging back with something heavy, an RPG team, maybe, or a crew-served weapon being set up. I called fire on the base of the grade. I called for the south op to displace to the secondary position. I called Doyle to the south wall. And then I heard a voice behind me. Voss. She had appeared at the ops center doorway the way she appeared everywhere, without announcement, without hurry. She was in full kit, plate carrier, helmet, her weapon slung muzzle down, and she was looking at the map I had on the table. The schoolhouse, she said. What? If they're hitting the post, they're also moving on the village. If somebody's coordinating this, and somebody is, they moved on the village first. The hostages are in the schoolhouse, and the schoolhouse is the lock center. They'll move the hostages when the post gets hit, because the post getting hit is the cover. I stared at her. Sir, she said flat, not unkind, just flat, the village. The radios were going. The south wall was in contact. The mortar was cycling. Doyle had it running smooth, round after round, the illumination keeping the draw lit and the gun trucks angling to cover the base of the grade. It was working. The attack on the post was, in the terms I understood, manageable. We were not overrun. We were not going to be overrun. But the village... I picked up the long-range handset. I tried the forward observer net. I tried the relay station at the eastern fob. I got static and a partial connect and more static. The dish had warped. Of course it had warped. It was 0300 in August on the Marin Reach and the dish had been warping since July. I looked at Voss. She was already looking at me. The relief column, I said. ETA is still 3 to 5 days. Yes, sir. I have no CAS. I have no QRF. I have no comms beyond line of sight. Yes, sir. The hostages are 2 clicks down that grade in a stone building that's being held by people who right now are using this contact as cover to do whatever they're going to do next. Yes, sir. The south wall opened up. The gun trucks were moving. Doyle's voice on the internal net, calm and controlled. The RPG team at the draw's mouth had deployed and missed the east gun truck, and Doyle's people had identified the position and were engaging. Everything was in motion. Everything was being handled. Except the schoolhouse. What do you need? I asked her. I don't know why I asked it that way. I don't know what I expected her to say. I think I asked it because I had run out of other questions. She said nothing. She picked up a small pack from beside the door. She'd had it there, already staged, and she walked out of the ops center into the dark. I didn't stop her. That is the thing I have turned over more times than I can count, in the decades since that night, in the years of command that followed, in the moments between sleep and waking when the mind goes back to the things it can't resolve. I didn't stop her. I gave one order, Doyle. I need eyes on Voss, and Doyle said, sir, I'm a little busy right now, and he was right, he was. And so I watched her walk to the south wall and speak to the two soldiers there, and then slip through the vehicle gap below the wall and disappear down the grade into the dark. The grade is 2 kilometers. In the dark, on broken shale, at 0300, with a firefight lighting the northern sky behind you, 2 kilometers is a very long walk. I managed the contact on the post. I want to be clear about that. The soldiers of Cop Harlow fought that engagement well, and Doyle ran the south wall the way a man runs it who has done this before, and the gun crews held their sectors and the mortar kept cycling, and by 0415 the draw was clear and the RPG team was either gone or down and we had 2 wounded, neither life-threatening, and the post was intact. I want to be clear about that because what happened in Sabbath was not a rescue from incompetence. The post held because the post was good, Doyle was good, the soldiers were good. But the property book had been a crime against accounting, and the illumination rounds that lit the draw were only in the system because a supply NCO had counted every pallet, and the north gun stop block had been fixed because the same NCO had read the maintenance logs back to March, and the south wall's sandbag bunkers at the southeast corner, the ones that corrected the angle of the old custom station's firing line, had been built on day 6 by 2 soldiers from the supply section, following a diagram that Voss had drawn from memory and given to Doyle without saying where the knowledge had come from. She had spent 9 days building the defense. She'd done it through the property book, through the logistics, through the corrections she'd flagged and the work she'd done without flagging it at all. She'd done it in plain sight, in a quartermaster flash, with a latrine roster on her clipboard, and I hadn't seen it. At 0440, the comms restored. The temperature dropped enough at pre-dawn for the dish to reseat, and I got the forward observer net, and I called the situation in. The operations officer at the FOB told me the relief column was being moved up, earliest arrival now 4 to 6 hours at first light. At 0510, Garza on the South Op reported movement on the grade. Uphill movement, northbound, a group moving slow. I put the gun truck on the grade approach with the spotlight, and I told Garza to hold fire until I gave the word, and I stood at the south wall and waited. What came up the grade, in the first gray light of the desert dawn, was not a threat. It was Voss. Behind her in a line were 21 children. The children of Sabbath, the ones who had been in the schoolhouse for the literacy class when the NGO workers were taken, the ones who had been kept in the back room of the school as leverage and as cover for the hostages, whose presence had been mentioned in the intelligence summary, and then not mentioned again, because they were not the named hostages and nobody had a plan for them. 21 children, the youngest perhaps 4 years old and carried on the back of a 12-year-old boy, the oldest perhaps 14, all of them in the plain cotton clothes they'd been wearing when the class started and hadn't changed since. Behind the children, the German aid worker, a man named, I learned later, Werner Haas, who had been a hostage for 16 days and who was limping on a left ankle that had been broken in the first week and had been walked on since. And behind him, supported on Haas's right side, the schoolteacher. A woman in her 50s, gray-haired, small, who had apparently spent the 16 days keeping the children calm and had the particular exhausted dignity of a person who has been doing something very hard for a long time and has not yet allowed herself to stop. 3 aid workers had been named in the intelligence summary. 2 came up the grade. I asked Voss about the 3rd when she reached the wall. She wasn't there when I arrived, she said. I didn't ask anything else. There were 21 children filing through the vehicle gap in the south wall, and Reyes was calling for the medic, and Garza and Fitch were coming down from the op to help, and the grade was quiet in the gray light, and there was too much to do. Voss set her pack down against the inside of the south wall. She unclipped her helmet. She ran a hand over her hair, the way you do when you've been wearing a helmet for a long time and your scalp itches. Then she picked the pack up again and walked back to the Connex area. because the supply section had morning accountability in 45 minutes, and somebody needed to run it. I watched her go. Doyle appeared at my elbow. He had blood on his sleeve, not his, he told me, one of the wounded from the south wall contact, and he was holding 2 cups of coffee, and he gave me one without asking. We stood at the south wall and watched the dawn come up over the Marin Reach. "Doyle," I said. "Sir?" "What just happened?" He drank his coffee. A long pause. The desert light came slow and flat across the shale, the color of old bone. "I think," he said, "the supply sergeant brought the hostages home." The children were fed from the MRE stores and given water and laid down in the main building on the sleeping mats from the off-duty barracks section, because 21 children can absorb a great deal of floor space and a great deal of sound, and the main building could hold both. Werner Haas's ankle was splinted by specialist Domings, the post's medic, who had trained on a TCCC course at Bragg, and who worked on Haas's ankle with a focus that suggested he was grateful for something straightforward to treat. Haas had a fever. Domings gave him fluids and antibiotics and told me to get him to a higher level of care in the next 12 hours. The schoolteacher, whose name was Fatima, and who was one of the most composed people I have met, asked through the interpreter whether the children could be given something to write with and something to write on, because they had not had school in 16 days, and that was, in her view, long enough. We found notebooks in the supply stores. Voss produced them from Container 2 without being asked, before the interpreter had finished translating the request. Fatima looked at the notebooks and then at Voss for a moment. Something passed between them that I didn't understand and that I have thought about since. The after-action was running in parallel with all of this. I was writing the initial report while Doyle ran the post, and the report kept hitting the problem that I didn't know how to describe what Voss had done in terms that fit any category on the form. The categories on the form were direct fire engagement, indirect fire engagement, medevac, route clearance, civil affairs action, other. What she had done was, I kept coming back to the word other. And the problem with other was that other requires a narrative, and my narrative kept running into the fact that I did not know what had happened in the schoolhouse between 0300 and 0510. I asked her at 0800. She was back at the Connex area, running morning accountability with her section. The 2 junior soldiers, Privates Osai and Kwan, were reading serial numbers off the items they'd left organized the night before, and Voss was checking them against the completed ledger with a pencil, making small ticks. I waited until they were done. "The schoolhouse," I said, "what happened?" She made one more mark in the ledger, then she closed it. "It was a logistics problem," she said. I waited. 21 children and 2 adults in a building held by 4 men, she said. The men were watching the north door because the north door is the obvious approach. The east window on the 2nd floor is too small for an adult in full kit. She paused. "I'm not in full kit when I need not to be." "You went through a 2nd floor window." "I had a conversation with the senior man," she said. "He was persuadable." I thought about the 2 men Haas had mentioned, the 2 who'd been found in the building by the unit that might eventually arrive. I thought about the word persuadable and the particular shape of what it was covering. "And the others," I said. "The other 2 were outside," she said, "watching the post contact. That was the coordinated element, 2 inside, 2 running the show from outside, and the idea was that when the post's response was fully committed, they'd move the hostages." She looked at me. "They didn't move fast enough." "You handled 4 armed men in the dark." "I handled 2, she said. "The other 2 had better things to worry about." A small pause. "The post's contact was very well handled, sir, the illumination especially." She said it the way you say a thing that is simply true, without gesture, without irony. "You're the one who found the rounds," I said. "I'm the one who counted the pallets," she said. I stood there for a moment. Osa and Quan were carefully not looking at either of us. The third aid worker, I said. The intelligence summary listed 3. Voss looked at the ledger. Something moved across her face, not quite sorrow, not quite something else. Very brief. The third aid worker had been dead for approximately 72 hours when I arrived, she said. The other hostages didn't know. The men inside had a reason to keep that information from them. She paused. I didn't tell Werner Haas in the schoolhouse. There will be a better time and a better place for that conversation. I nodded. She opened the ledger again, a clear signal. Voss, I said. She looked up. I should have moved the south op, I said. She held my look for a moment, no particular expression. You moved it in your head by day 3, sir, she said. That's most of the way there. It was the kindest thing she could have said, and she said it the way she said everything, flat, without decoration, as a simple fact, like a measurement that came out roughly where you'd hoped. I walked back to the ops center. Thibodeau was at the burn barrel, drinking his 4th coffee of the morning, watching Voss walk back into the connex. Hell of a supply sergeant, he said. I didn't answer. He looked at me sideways. You know the Pilgrim story, sir. I've heard it, I said. 11 from a stone house, he said. Lone operator, no backup, no call sign on file. He shook his head. 21 kids and a German. I'd say she's getting better at it. He finished his coffee and walked away. I stood very still for a long time. The relief column arrived at 11:43 in the morning, 4 hours and 22 minutes after first light, which was faster than promised and felt, given the previous 12 hours, like a very long time. 3 vehicles, an up-armored HMMWV in the lead with a Mod Deuce on the roof, a medium truck behind it with 2 fire teams, and in the last vehicle, in the front passenger seat, a command sergeant major named Reese, tall, lean, 60 years old if he was a day, with a face that looked like something that had been left outside in bad weather for a long time and had come out harder for it. CSM Reese got out of the truck before it had fully stopped. He looked at the post, the south wall's sandbag extensions, the mortar pit, the gun trucks still in their overnight positions, and he made a small sound in his chest that I read as professional assessment. He looked at me, Lieutenant Brandt. Sergeant Major. He looked past me at the post, at the children visible through the main building's open door, at the medical kit spread out near where Haas was still resting. A complete survey, the way a man looks at a space he is trying to understand. We got your initial report, he said. The wash contact in the hostage recovery, a pause, who ran the direct action. I opened my mouth. And then I stopped. Because across the compound, coming from the connex area with a clipboard and an expression of mild irritation at being interrupted in the middle of morning accountability, was Voss. She was walking toward the supply section's vehicles to check the incoming resupply manifest against what the relief column had brought. She was doing her job. She had been doing her job since the moment she arrived, and she was going to keep doing her job, and she had absolutely no interest in what was happening at the vehicle gate with me and the relief column's CSM. Reese had turned to follow my look. I watched him see her, and I watched something happen to his face. It was not dramatic. It was not the wide-eyed shock of a man confronted with something impossible. It was quieter than that. It was the face of a man who sees a thing he believed was a legend, a fixed, permanent, slightly mythological thing, walking toward him across a gravel compound with a clipboard and morning dust on her boots, and who understands in the space of 1 second that the legend was never a legend at all. It was just a woman who did a thing, and didn't make it into a story, and moved on to the next thing. Reese said very quietly, "Pilgrim." Not a question. Voss heard it. She was 15 feet away. She slowed slightly, not stopping, not quite, and she looked at him. A very long look. Then she continued to the supply vehicles. Reese stood perfectly still for a moment. Then, with the precision of a man performing an act that carries weight, not as a reflex, not as a courtesy, but as a deliberate thing. Carefully chosen, he came to attention. And he saluted her. A staff sergeant. She was wearing staff sergeant's rank, the same rank that runs the supply section at a half-dozen bases across 2 theaters, the rank that manages the property book and runs the latrine roster and stays in the connex and counts boxes. A sergeant major with 30-something years of service, in front of 3 vehicle crews and the full garrison of Cop Harlow, coming to attention and saluting a staff sergeant. His hand was not entirely steady. She turned back to him. She looked at the salute for a moment with the level expression I had come to understand was not blankness. Was, in fact, its opposite was a kind of density, a great deal of weight held very still. She returned it, one sharp, correct salute. Then she turned back to the supply vehicles and resumed checking the manifest. Reese held his position for a moment after his hand came down. Then he looked at me. I had nothing to say. I was a second lieutenant who had handed this woman the latrine roster on his first morning in command, who had not moved the South Op when she'd told him twice, who had not given her a sector on the wire, who had told her to stay in the connex and count boxes while the world her 9 days of work had organized was the only reason 31 soldiers and 21 children and 2 survivors were standing in the morning sunlight instead of not. "She fix your property book?" Reese asked. "Yes, Sergeant Major," I said. He nodded, as if this explained everything, which it did, and explained nothing, which was also true. "She usually does," he said. He walked past me into the post. Word moves fast in a 31-person post. By noon, every soldier at Cop Harlow knew what Reese had said. Not because anyone announced it, not because anyone made a speech. The Army doesn't work that way, and Harlow was particularly the kind of post where the men communicated in looks and silences, and the careful way they set down a coffee cup. But Garza had been at the vehicle gate, and Thibodeau had been at the burn barrel close enough to hear. And Domings was walking back from the medical tent when Reese saluted, and Domings had good eyes and a long memory. Nobody said anything to Voss. She would not have received it well. She was busy with the resupply manifest, and then she was busy integrating the new supplies into the container system, and then she was doing the paperwork that transferred temporary custody of the 21 children to the relief column civil affairs element, which required forms that nobody on the post had a copy of, and which she appeared to have memorized. At 1400, the flatbed truck that would take her rotation was ending. This had been her last post. The resupply run and the relief column were the mechanism of her own departure, was loaded and ready. She had 1 pack. She had the completed ledger. She had the property book, fully reconciled, annotated in 2 colors of pen, with a cover memo to the incoming supply NCO that summarized the discrepancies corrected and the items flagged for follow-up. Doyle walked her to the truck. I walked behind them at a distance, because I didn't know what to say, and I'd learned in the last 9 days that Voss didn't need things said to her in order to know them. The garrison had formed up. I don't know who started it. I didn't order it. But as Voss walked from the south wall toward the vehicle gate and the waiting flatbed, the soldiers of Cop Harlow were standing. Not in formal formation, not at parade rest, not in a row, just standing, facing the route she walked, in the quiet way of men who have something to do with their bodies that they don't have words for. As she passed each one, they saluted. Not on command, not in sequence, each man at his own moment when she was level with him, hand rising to the brim of his patrol cap or his helmet or his cover in whatever he had on his head, held until she'd passed. She looked forward. She did not hurry. She did not slow. She walked the route the way she'd walked everything at Harlow, with the particular quality I now understood was not indifference but its opposite. A total and unsentimental presence, right here, right now, doing the thing that was in front of her. At the vehicle gate she stopped. She turned back. She looked at the post, at the HESCO walls and the stone wall and the sandbag bunkers at the southeast corner and the north gun with its corrected stop block and the Connex containers standing open in the afternoon heat. At the soldiers. At Doyle, who was standing 3 feet behind her and looking somewhere past her shoulder with great intensity. At me, the second lieutenant who'd handed her the latrine roster. She raised her hand in one clean, level salute, held it for 3 seconds, brought it down. Then she climbed into the flatbed and sat on the pallet of empty boxes that was all that was going back to the fob, and the truck rolled through the gate and down the grade, and we watched it go until it curved behind the shale outcrop and was gone. The desert resumed its silence. It was a different silence than it had been 11 days ago when I'd arrived. I knew that now. Not emptier, fuller, filled with all the things that had been in it that I hadn't been able to read. Doyle came to stand beside me. "She's been doing this a long time," I said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," he said. "Does she always leave like that?" "Like what?" I thought about how to describe it. The clipboard, the completed ledger, the walk to the truck, the one salute. "Like the work didn't need a name," I said. Doyle looked at the gate, at the dust still settling where the truck had turned. "That's Pilgrim," he said. "That's always been Pilgrim. I have commanded at every level since that morning. Platoon, company, battalion. A brief and punishing tour at the brigade level that taught me that command at scale is mostly the art of creating conditions for the right people to do the right things at the right time, and then staying out of their way. I have given orders that were right and orders that were wrong. I have signed property books and property books have signed me, metaphorically speaking, in the way that a bad property book always finds its author eventually. I have been in 3 more firefights after the Marin Reach, 2 of them worse by measure of casualties and complexity, and 1 of them worse by measure of what it cost the people around me. I do not catalog them here as competition. They happened. They shaped what I know. What the Marin Reach shaped was something different, and earlier and more basic. It shaped the way I look at NCOs. I mean that precisely. I mean that every time I have stood in a room where a senior NCO with a quiet face was being talked over, or handed a task below her training, or asked to explain her expertise to someone whose rank superseded her understanding, I have thought about the South Draw, and the stop block, and the illumination rounds in Container 2 on Pallet 7, condition serviceable, recommend immediate entry and integration into the fire support plan. I have thought about what it costs to not listen. At the division level, years later, I started a practice that my staff thought was eccentric. Before every major operation, I would sit with the supply section, the whole section, not just the OIC, and I would ask them what they were seeing in the logistics. Not what the plan assumed about the logistics. What they were actually seeing in the containers and on the manifests and in the maintenance records and on the ground. I found things that would have killed people. Twice. Found them in a property book and a maintenance log and a conversation with a staff sergeant who had been told, politely, that her concerns had been noted. I put her concerns in the operations order, both times. The first time, my S4 asked me where I was getting my analysis from. I told him, a supply sergeant on a high desert border post who handed me a cup of coffee and told me the South Op was covering the wrong ground. He looked at me like I had said something in a language he didn't speak. I could not give him the name. I don't know, honestly, if the name I knew was the real one. I know the call sign. I know what it means now, in the particular way you know the meaning of a word after you've seen it in its full usage. Not as a definition, but as an experience. Something that changed your understanding of what was possible and what was always there and simply not looked at. I have told the Pilgrim story around fires. I tell it the way Thibodeau told it, as a true story that sounds like a legend because that's what it is. I tell it in the form I know. The stone schoolhouse, the 11 people, the lone operator with no call sign on file, the unit that arrived 40 minutes later. I tell the version that ends there, because that's the version that stands on its own. I don't tell the part about the property book, the illumination rounds, the stop block, the sandbag bunkers at the southeast corner, the latrine roster. I don't tell it because most people aren't ready to understand that the defense of Cop Harlow and the walk down the grade to the schoolhouse in Sabbath were the same thing, the same mind, the same patience, the same 9 days of a woman setting herself down so completely into a role that the role could hold everything she knew and nobody would look at it too closely, until it was too late to not take it seriously. The garb of supply, the garb of no self. She walked in plain as a supply NCO reconciling a property book, and she built the defense from the inside out. And when the defense needed one more piece that the property book couldn't provide, she picked up a small pack and walked into the dark and brought 21 children up a grade in the first gray light of morning, because that was the work in front of her, and the work in front of her was what she did. 11 from a stone house, the legend said. 21 children and 2 survivors, said the after-action report, which said other in the category field and left the narrative column to do its best. The after-action report did not say Pilgrim. It didn't need to. I signed it as the commanding officer of Cop Harlow on the Marin Reach above the Collie's Wash, a 23-year-old second lieutenant on his first command, and I wrote in the narrative column everything I could remember, and at the bottom I wrote, "The defense held because of the work of the NCOs of this post, particularly the supply section. Recommend recognition for outstanding performance under fire." It was the most inadequate sentence I have ever written. It was the best I knew how to do. A month later, when I was back at the FOB filling out the paperwork for my next assignment, I tried to find Voss's personnel file. I had a reason I told myself was administrative. The file didn't exist in the system I had access to. The attachment orders from the training detachment at Bragg had a routing number that dead-ended at a headquarters element I didn't have clearance to query. The quartermaster flash was, I eventually understood, not a quartermaster flash. The property book she'd completed and annotated and handed to Doyle, 94 pages, every serial number accounted for, every discrepancy documented, is still, as far as I know, the cleanest property book in the history of Cop Harlow. The incoming supply NCO who received it called it a masterwork of military accounting and asked, 3 weeks into his tour, who had done it. Nobody remembered her name. That is not entirely true. Doyle remembered it, I remember it. But when Doyle told the Pilgrim story around the burned barrel the following rotation, he told the 11 from the Stonehouse version, the legend version, the version that has no supply sergeant in it and no illumination rounds and no 94-page property book. He told it the way she would have wanted it told. That's Pilgrim. That's always been Pilgrim.